Hello, and very welcome. Our channel narrates the life stories of our viewers from all around the world. To protect individuals' privacy, names are sometimes altered in the stories. I am Dina. Unlike most children who are usually very attached to their mother since birth, I would only calm down when I was in my father's arms. My father was a very good man, and because he was very artistic, he had a lot of sensitivity and delicacy. I always thought this trait of his came from his artistic nature. I always made my best memories with my father, and I remember that on the days when my father went to work, I constantly thought about how I wished he would come back soon so we could ride bikes together in the small yard of our house. One of the best memories I have with my father is when he taught me how to ride a bicycle. I fell many times, but I was confident that I would succeed because I knew my father had my back. My father always played the role of a steadfast mountain for me. My mother was a strong woman, and next to my father, she was very powerful. Many times I thought that the strength my father had, he actually received from my mother. Unlike many children who are affected by the negative dynamics between their parents, my parents loved each other deeply, and even among our relatives, their love was obvious. I only had one older brother who was 10 years older than me, and because of this, I received a lot of love from my family since I was born after 10 years of waiting. According to my mother, they had tried for a child many times but had always faced disappointment. But one day, when they least expected it, they discovered that I was on the way. My relationship with my brother was very warm. He was a blend of my father and mother to me. He was always my companion, support, and partner, even though he was much older than me. Since my father was a calligrapher and my mother was into music, and my brother was a good painter, I grew up loving art. I tried all kinds of artistic endeavors since childhood and even earned money at a young age. When my brother reached the age to marry and fell in love with a girl from the north of the country, he had to move there. At first, I was very restless when he left because my brother was like a friend and confidant to me, and we had a very close relationship. I had just entered the guidance school, and I felt I really needed my brother's presence, so the first sadness I experienced in my life was when he moved to another city, although he visited us every 2 months. After that, my father worked hard to help me cope with my brother's absence. I tried to adapt to the new situation, and after a while, I got used to him not being around. But we still kept in touch, and I always waited for his visits. With my brother's departure, I began thinking about how one day I too would share the love that my family had received with someone special, with my partner in life. I entered high school and chose an art major. Eventually, I got into architecture, a field I loved and worked day and night to be the best. Early on, I managed to take on good projects. During that time, I met a boy named Henry. Henry was in my major too, and like me, he had a passion for art. Our connection grew stronger when we realized how much we understood each other's feelings and could empathize. From then on, going to cafes and visiting art galleries became our way of connecting, allowing us to spend more time together. Henry seemed like the person I had always envisioned in my dreams. After I felt something like love developing between Henry and me, and he confessed his feelings to me, the first person I told was my father. I showed my father a picture of Henry and talked to him about his personality traits. My father, who trusted me so much, always said, "I raised you, so whatever choice you make, I will support you, and I am sure you will make the best choice." For this reason, my father only reminded me to be careful in my relationship and not to let Henry get too close to my personal boundaries, and to guard my heart so that if things didn't turn out as I wanted, my heart wouldn't break. I always followed my father's advice, so when Henry confessed his feelings to me, even though my heart longed for him, I tried not to show much emotion. After a while, our friendship deepened, and the love I had always imagined blossomed between us. Henry had a personality like my father's. For this reason, I was attracted to him, and I always reminded myself that love needs care, and any love that is damaged at its root, even if watered multiple times afterward, will still decay. This was something my father always told me. Because of this, Henry and I had built our relationship from the beginning on trust and respect. After a short time, Henry talked to his family, and I did the same with my father. After both families agreed, Henry came to propose to me. Henry was an only child, so he, like me, had grown up in a family where everyone showered him with love, especially because his mother had fertility issues, and after many struggles, Henry was the gift God gave them. Our engagement went well, and after that, Henry and I decided to get married quickly without holding a ceremony. We were happy, and our relationship improved even more after marriage. However, after some time, I started feeling that Henry wasn't as charismatic a man as I had hoped, and his delicate, soft nature, which he always approached things with, made me feel a bit disappointed. But I didn't bring it up and kept it to myself because, in my opinion, it wasn't a huge issue, and I wanted to resolve it within myself. But as time passed, these traits of Henry's became more noticeable to me. At that point, I began to find myself attracted to men who were into sports and had strong physiques, while Henry was a man who wasn't into fitness and didn't care much about his appearance. He always dressed in simple, artistic styles. Since we had just married, I didn't want to impose any rules on him or try to change him, but I started feeling that this emptiness inside me was because I wanted someone who had a bit of charm and could sometimes challenge me with his words. Before this, Henry had never argued with me, and he never disagreed with me on anything, which made me feel that our relationship might have an issue. I believed that sometimes arguing and having disagreements could bring people closer, or even make them fall in love with each other more. Then I got sick, and because Henry was a very family-oriented man who cared a lot about me, all it took was for me to have a problem, and Henry would act like a father to me. One night when he saw that I wasn't feeling well, he insisted on taking me to the clinic. At first, I resisted, but when he insisted, I asked him to let me go alone, and Henry didn't object. I took a cab and went to the clinic alone. Since it was quite late, the clinic was very quiet, and only the doctor was there. When he wrote my prescription and included an injection, he decided that he would personally administer it. The doctor was a relatively young man and, of course, very well built. When I first saw him, I couldn't help but notice his physique, and since I had recently started being attracted to men like him, I found myself admiring him. I also had a good physique, so I cared about body appearance as well. At first, when I realized that the doctor was going to give me the injection, I told him I wasn't in a hurry and could come back the next day for the injection. But the doctor insisted, saying that my condition might worsen, so it was better to do it that night. I agreed, and after gathering my medication, I went into the injection room, lay down on the bed, and waited for the doctor to come. When I heard his deep voice, I looked up and saw that he was staring at me. When he noticed my gaze, he came closer with the injection and asked me to relax so I would feel less pain. Since I had always been afraid of injections, I closed my eyes to reduce my fear and waited for the 2 injections. After he gave me the first shot, I waited for the second, but then I felt his hand on my back, and when I opened my eyes, I realized the doctor was getting closer to me. At first, I pulled back a little, but then he told me not to call him Mr. anymore, and his name is Ian, and without paying attention to me, he got closer. Since I had already found him attractive and he had captured my attention, I didn't resist and allowed him to come closer. He transferred such a good feeling to me that I didn't even care that I was married or that I was committed to someone else. That night, since there was no one else in the clinic except for us, things took a turn that I hadn't expected. Lon closed the door, and inside that room, my first connection with Lon formed. Lon seemed to be the exact man I had imagined in my mind and found attractive because he was both very charismatic and had a great physique. After I was done with my visit, he asked for my contact number and said, if possible, we should stay in touch. Since I had never been used to wearing rings, no one ever noticed that I was married unless I mentioned it myself. That night, Lon didn't ask me anything about my marriage, and I didn't bring it up either. I just saved his number in my phone and then headed home. When I got home, Henry asked why I was so late, and I made up an excuse, saying that since it was late, most places were closed, which caused the delay. Henry didn't ask further questions because, overall, he was not the type to interrogate me. He always trusted me and believed what I said. So, that night passed without anything unusual happening, even though whenever I was with Henry and looked at him, I kept thinking of the moments I had with Lon, and a feeling of guilt lingered in my mind. But I told myself that Henry, with his way of thinking, would never notice the mistakes I was making, so my life wouldn't be harmed. The next day when I woke up, Henry had already gone to work, and I wanted to check my phone. I saw a message from Lon, starting with a good morning. Since I felt my heart flutter, I began messaging him back. After my first message, he called me, and then he asked if I had time that day to meet up. This time, he invited me to his house. The event that had to happen between us had already happened, and it was in his office, so I was no longer afraid of going to his place. I decided to act a little distant at first and rejected his request, but after his insistence, I agreed. We set a plan for me to go to his house the next morning. The address he sent was in the upper part of the city. When I arrived at his house, I was amazed by the beauty of the house's exterior. It was a large, old house, but very impressive. The house had a large courtyard where he had prepared breakfast for me. At first, Lon told me about himself, how he was an only child and both his parents had passed away. The only thing left to him was the house. He also told me that he'd been in relationships with many people, but always remained loyal to those he was with. He said that when he started a relationship with someone, he would never turn his back on them. Since I didn't want to lose him, I decided not to tell him the truth about my own situation. So, I confirmed his statement and told him that for me, honesty and truthfulness were the most important qualities in a relationship. Lon spoke about his past, mentioning how many girls were only interested in him for his money and appearance, and that none of them truly had feelings for him. He said he hoped one day to find someone who would want him just for who he was. When I sensed that Lon was talking about his past to make me open up, I changed the topic and told him that there was no need to remind each other of the past. What mattered was the present. Then we went inside the house, and I change my clothes. Since I had a good physique too, Lon asked me if I did any sports, and I told him that I did occasionally. Then he came closer to me. As Lon approached me, my heart started to race, and I felt weak in front of him. When he got even closer, I forgot everything about my life with Henry. When Lon went to the kitchen to get me some water, I looked at my phone and saw that Henry had called me several times. I called him back, and his voice shook with worry as he repeatedly asked if I was feeling okay. I told him to calm down and then said I had gone to a friend's house. When Lon came back, I quickly ended the call. Now I had to lie to both of them. That day, Lon insisted on driving me home, but since I didn't want him to know my address yet, I asked him to drop me off near my father's house. He agreed and left me at the street corner. I went to my father's place because he was the only one who could calm me down. I asked my father, what should someone do if they slip and their heart trembles, no matter how wrong they are? My father, as always, gave me short, wise advice and told me, sometimes a person loses their entire life just for a few moments of happiness. You always have to know what you're willing to lose for what you gain. The whole time, I was thinking about my father's words, even though I knew I was making a mistake. I realized that I was risking my life and reputation for a few moments of pleasure. I knew that if my father found out what I was doing, he would feel as if he had failed in raising me, although I knew that my actions had nothing to do with his upbringing. This was an internal struggle I had. Sometimes I felt like I was deeply prone to seeking variety, unable to commit to a single goal. Then, as my relationship with Ian grew closer, I started having arguments with Henry. Even though Henry tried to understand me, since we had never fought before, he kept asking what my issue with him was. When I told him that I wanted him to be a bit more masculine and assertive, Henry told me he didn't see any need to control me or to set boundaries because he was completely confident in me and knew I was a sensible woman who didn't need someone watching over her. Hearing this only made me angrier as I realized I had betrayed all the trust Henry had in me, and there was no way to fix it. That day, I stormed out of the house angrily and went to Ian's place. At least with him, I could forget that my real life was with Henry. But on the other hand, I was worried about how Ian would react if he found out about the big lie I had told him. So, I decided that the next day, when Henry went to work, I would invite Ian over to my place to make everything look normal and to eliminate any doubts he might have. We coordinated it, and the next day, I prepared the house to welcome Ian. I removed every photo of Henry and me from the tables and arranged the place to look like a single person's apartment. When Ian arrived, he first complimented the style I'd put into decorating, and then mentioned that my home had the warmth of a place filled with love. His words shook me because I knew that if there was any love in this house, it was only from Henry's side. After offering him refreshments, I went to put on a beautiful red dress he had bought for me. As usual, he praised my beauty when he saw me, and then he came closer. I didn't think about the fact that this room also belonged to Henry, where we had spent so many days and nights in love. Here I was, bringing another man into this space, ignoring everything, and letting myself enjoy the moments. After we were together, Ian was still in my house, and I was walking around in that same red dress. We were chatting, talking about dreams and aspirations we hadn't yet achieved. Suddenly, we both heard the door open and turned to look. I was frozen in place, standing face to face with Henry. In that situation, dressed as I was, there was no lie that could cover up what I'd done. Henry caught me with Ian that day, but the issue I faced was that even Ian, with wide eyes, was staring at me as if waiting for an explanation from me. I had told both of them a big lie, and they were both looking at me, stunned. When Ian saw my silence, he turned to Henry and asked him what his relationship with me was. Henry, lowering his head, replied softly, "She's my wife." Ian's face turned red, and he came toward me angrily, shouting and asking if I was married. He grabbed my arms and kept pressing me with that question. Henry stepped forward and separated Ian from me. In my heart, I thought that even at that moment, Henry was still looking out for me. A small part of me hoped that maybe, after the dust settled, Henry would still forgive me and our life could continue. After pulling Ian away, Henry turned to him and asked if he hadn't known that Dina was married. Ian, in anger, shouted, "No," adding that he would never be so dishonorable as to have a relationship with a married woman. Then he said, "That night when I met her at the clinic, she was alone, without a ring, and I assumed she wasn't married." As Henry listened to Ian reveal the truth, he turned to me and said, "So all your words were lies, and that night you came back late because you'd made a new friend." When Henry finished speaking, I began to cry and tried to explain my mistake. But Henry told me that he had always loved me, that he had trusted me even more than his own eyes. If anyone had ever told him that Dina had made a mistake, he wouldn't have believed it. But now, because of my actions, I had shattered that trust. Neither Henry nor Ian waited for my explanation. They both left the house, leaving me alone in the living room that day, wearing that red dress. I stood there, knowing that even if my actions had been hidden for months, this moment was inevitable. With Henry's words, I was certain that I had lost the loving life we shared. I couldn't stop thinking about how I would face my father and try to explain what I had done. That same day, I went to see my father. I had cried so much that he could tell just by looking at me that something was wrong. I had always shared everything openly with him, without fear, but this time I couldn't look him in the eyes. Nevertheless, I began my story, telling him that I had become just like those people who slip and lose everything for a few moments of pleasure. My father, who seemed to already understand everything, looked at me for a moment and then simply said that sometimes people aren't upset by the mistake itself, but by the fact that it came from someone they didn't expect it from. At that moment, I wondered if Henry had already spoken to my father. But my father explained that he had noticed the changes in my behavior, my restlessness, and even Henry's moments of hesitation. He had known I was falling into something that didn't match my true heart. Even so, he had remained silent, believing that every person needs to experience their own life lessons. My father's words brought more tears to my eyes, and I realized the magnitude of my mistake. I had even let down my father. That night, when I returned home, I found Henry packing his clothes. When I cried and expressed my regret, asking him to give me another chance, he told me that sometimes the best thing to do is to leave so that the dignity of the good memories can remain intact. And so, Henry and I separated. After that, no matter how many times I tried to reach out to Ian, he wouldn't agree to be with me. He told me that someone who could lie so easily didn't deserve a pure love. With a mistake I thought would be fleeting or, at the very least, would go unnoticed, I lost everything. My life, my dreams. Thanks to Henry, the house remained mine, but ultimately I, who had once been blessed with the kind of love my parents shared, had destroyed it myself. My father taught me the greatest lesson of my life, that even though he knew I was going astray, he believed that every person must live through their own lessons and fate. Trying to prevent someone from their own path doesn't help them. It only stops them from growing. Through what happened in my life, I learned that we all experience love, but more important than love itself is learning to protect it, something I failed to do. Now, after all these years, that love remains only as a regret for me.